really great poets. So tonight is a celebration of both American and Greek poets, both modern and ancient, just to serve as a sort of an inspirational kind of reminder of why people go back to these poets and their work. Sappho is one of the poetess that we'll be reading from, and it's remarkable to me that she wrote in 600 BC. So that means people are still so intrigued by her voice, which had a purity, something of a whimsical nature to it. It's amazing to me that people still would go back to someone 2,600 years after their death. We only have fragments of her work, but they're discovering more and more papyrus and that has more of her work on it. So that's great. There's a garbage dump in Egypt that has been very fruitful for that. So we're going to start with the Beats, Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg, and then even go back to Ezra Pound, our greatest literator, who, as eccentric as he was. And then we'll move to some modern Greek poets like Elytis and Kavafi and Yanis Ritsos. And then we will have the later part of the evening devoted to, we'll end with Bob Dylan, but there will be a poem by Kavafi about Alexandria that was adapted by Leonard Cohen. So it'll be sort of an interesting survey of poets, both modern and ancient, but poets who really have captured the ears of all of us. So, and tonight I'll be joined by Marlene Angelidis, who is has a very chameleon-like profile. She's from the Royal Academy of Music, the London postgrad course in musical theater and Shakespeare. She went direct to the West End to Pop Stars, the American Idol precursor in Europe. She was in a platinum-selling girl group, HI5. Sounds like MI6, I guess not. Signed to Warner Music in Greece, represented Cyprus at the Eurovision Song Contest, and fronted a jazz tour in the UK, toured the world as main support act to Greece's #1 pop act. And I had the pleasure of directing Marlene in a play called My Wife in a Chador. She's currently in the all-girl band of Led Zeppelin covers, which sounds great. And they're often doing gigs all over the country now. So, this first poem is by Gary Snyder, and it's called 4 Poems for Robin. It was written in 1968, and just briefly, I actually, as a teenager, had the pleasure of seeing Snyder read up at the University of Buffalo, and it was like meeting the poet laureate of the Woodstock tribes, which he was with Ginsberg, He remember he had a long braided ponytail and he had a Native American poncho with red and yellow wool, and it was really a euphoric experience to hear him read. And lo and behold, a few years ago, somehow I heard that he was reading at 42nd Street Library, so I went to see that. And in Buffalo, there had been hundreds of people. I mean, he was really like the dean of the Woodstock generation. Along with Ginsberg. But there he was with a few dozen souls in one of their auditoriums at 42nd Street Library, and he had become a non-stellar academic in teaching in some university. And I don't know, I just, it was sort of a bittersweet kind of encounter to see how important poetry had at one time been, and it had become something with not a lot of interest from a lot of people. So hopefully we hardy few, we band of brothers here tonight, will celebrate some great poetry. So this is called 4 Poems for Robin from 1968. 1. So washing it out once in Suaslaw Forest, I slept under rhododendron All night, blossoms fell, shivering on a sheet of cardboard, feet stuck in my pack, hands deep in my pockets, barely able to sleep. I remembered when we were in school, sleeping together in a big, warm bed. We were the youngest lovers. When we broke up, we were only 19. Now our friends are married. You teach school back east. I don't mind living this way. Green hills, the long blue beach. But sometimes, sleeping in the open, I think back when I had you. 2. A spring night in Shikoku-ji. 8 years ago this May, we walked under cherry blossoms at night in an orchard in Oregon. All that I wanted then is forgotten now, but you. Here in the night, in a garden of the old capital, I feel the trembling ghost of Yugao. I remember your cool body, naked under a summer cotton dress. 3. An autumn morning in Shikoku-ji. Last night, watching the Pleiades, breath smoking in the moonlight, bitter memory like vomit choked my throat. I unrolled a sleeping bag on mats on the porch under thick autumn stars. In dream, you appeared 3 times in 9 years. Wild, cold, and accusing. I woke shamed and angry. The pointless wars of the heart. Almost dawn. Venus and Jupiter. The first time I have ever seen them close. 4. December at Yaze. You said that October in the tall, dry grass by the orchard when you chose to be free. Again, someday, maybe 10 years. After college, I saw you one time. You were strange. I was obsessed with a plan. Now 10 years and more have gone by. I've always known where you were. I might have gone to you, hoping to win your love back. You still are single. I didn't. I thought I must make it alone. I have done that. Only in dream, like this dawn, does the grave, awed intensity of our young love return to my mind, to my flesh. We had what the others all crave and seek. We left it behind at 19. I feel ancient, as though I had lived many lives, and may never now know if I am a fool or have done what my karma demands. Now, this next poem is by the godfather of all American poets from the 50s on, especially the beats, by Allen Ginsberg. And a few words about Allen Ginsberg. He's from Newark. His poem, Howl, which I'm going to read an excerpt from, was done at an art gallery in October 1955 called the Six Gallery. And it was an epical moment in American spoken word poetry. It even ended up in a court case for obscenity, which the judge famously allowed, said if we shut this up, we got to shut everybody up. So that was a big victory for freedom of expression. But Ginsberg was coming from gave new meaning to dysfunctional family. His mother was a card-carrying Communist Party member, who was also schizophrenic and who would take him on the bus ride to her therapist, which was apparently very upsetting. Ginsberg was certainly a man of the left, but I would call him a communist with a small c, and he in fact went down to Cuba to embrace Castro, but Castro found his desire and activities for freedom of expression and ending homosexual oppression somewhat disconcerting, so he was ejected from Cuba. He was ejected to Czechoslovakia, where you would think maybe he'd done better, but unfortunately they didn't appreciate his non-materialism point of view, so he was also ejected from Czechoslovakia. He was very inspired by William Carlos Williams, whose famous poem, Patterson is about the wonderful waterfalls in Patterson that are still there. He loved Blake. He made an album that I used to have as a young person, Songs of Innocence, with his harmonium and reciting Blake. I had the opportunity to meet Allen Ginsberg once. I heard somehow that he was reading Crossing Brooklyn Ferry by Walt Whitman on the spot where the Brooklyn Ferry hit Manhattan, which was the South Street Seaport Pier. And that was before it became Disneyland on the pier, which is what it was before Hurricane Sandy. But and that was interesting. Already his time had also, there was 100 people there on a Saturday morning or something. And I went up to him, and he was very approachable, and I mentioned I had traveled to India, and that, of course, got a rise out of him. He brought me over to meet Peter Orlowski, his mate, and but you know, by then, from being a globally recognized figure by the mid '80s, already his time had sort of become an afterglow of what it had formerly been. And he also ended up teaching part of the CUNY system somewhere. So I don't know, it's just interesting as I was going over these biographical notes, how people, you know, times change, they change, and but Howell, even Snyder, who was at the Sixth Gallery reading, said, it clearly spoke, as everyone could see, to the condition of the people. So just remember, the 55 was people going to the actor's studio. Actors would go in a full suit with a white shirt and a tie. You would be hard pressed to find a white shirt and a tie today, but that's what people like. So he was, in a way, his Howell was against the go-along conformity of the 50s. The veterans who had come back from World War II want to just sit and veg out, understandably, after the trauma they'd been through. So, but the younger people of that generation, that was not satisfying. They wanted their own piece of the action. So this is what Ginsberg unleashed on the world. Howl by Allen Ginsberg for Carl Solomon. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix, angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, who, poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant, cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake light tragedy among the scholars of war, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms and underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to their terror through the wall, who got busted in their pubic beards returning to Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York, who ate fire in paint hotels or drank turpentine in Paradise Alley, death or purgatory their torsos night after night with dreams, with drugs, with waking nightmares, alcohol and cock and endless balls, incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mind, leaping toward poles of Canada and Patterson, illuminating all the motionless world of time between. Peyote solidities of halls, backyard green tree cemetery dawns, wine drunkenness over the rooftops, storefront boroughs of tea-head joyride, neon blinking traffic light, sun and moon and tree vibrations in the roaring winter dusks of Brooklyn, ash can rantings and kind king light of mind, who chained themselves to subways for the endless ride from Battery to Holy Bronx on Benzedrine until the noise of wheels and children brought them down, shuddering, mouth-racked and battered, bleak of brain, all drained of brilliance in the drear light of Zoo, who sank all night in submarine light of Bigfords, floated out and sat through the stale beer afternoon in desolate Fugazis, listening to the crack of doom on the hydrogen jukebox, who talked continuously 70 hours from park to pad to bar to Bellevue to museum to the Brooklyn Bridge. A lost battalion of platonic conversationalists jumping down the stoops, off fire escapes, off windowsills, off Empire State, out of the moon. Yakety-yakketing, screaming, vomiting, whispering facts and memories and anecdotes and eyeball kicks and shocks of hospitals and jails and wars. Whole intellects disgorged in total recall for 7 days and nights with brilliant eyes meet with the synagogue cast on the pavement. Who vanished into nowhere Zen, New Jersey, leaving a trail of ambiguous picture postcards of Atlantic City Hall. Suffering Eastern sweats and Tangerian bone grindings and migraines of China under junk withdrawal in Newark bleak furnished rooms. Who wandered around and around at midnight in the railroad yard wondering where to go and went, leaving no broken hearts. Who lit cigarettes in boxcars, racketing through snow toward lonesome farms in grandfather night. Who studied Plotinus, Poe, St. John of the Cross, telepathy, and Bach Kabbalah because the cosmos instinctively vibrated at their feet in Kansas. Who loaned it through the streets of Idaho, seeking visionary Indian angels who were visionary Indian angels. Who thought they were only mad when Baltimore gleamed in supernatural ecstasy. Who jumped in limousines with the Chinamen of Oklahoma on the impulse of winter midnight streetlight, small town rain. Who lounged hungry and lonesome through Houston, seeking jazz or sex or soup, and followed the brilliant Spaniard to converse about America and eternity, a hopeless task, and so took ship to Africa. Who disappeared into the volcanoes of Mexico, leaving behind nothing but the shadow of dungarees and the lava and ash of poetry scattered in fireplace Chicago. Who reappeared on the West Coast, investigating the FBI in beards and shorts with big pacifist eyes, sexy in their dark skin, passing out incomprehensible leaflets. Who burned cigarette holes in their arms, protesting the narcotic tobacco haze of capitalism. Who distributed super-communist pamphlets in Union Square, weeping and undressing while the sirens of Los Alamos wailed them down and wailed down Wall, and the Staten Island ferry also wailed. Who broke down crying in white gymnasiums, naked and trembling before the machinery of other skeletons. Okay. Thank you. So now we're going to go to Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound is a very controversial figure, but he is the greatest literateur of the 20th century. T.S. Eliot dedicated The Wasteland, Il Megliore Fabbricante, to the better maker, to Ezra Pound. And yet, I mean, he wrote poetry as a history of the world in his cantos. Unfortunately, he also was very much against usury and became anti-Semitic, and also became a fan of Mussolini, which led to him to broadcast for Mussolini during World War II. I believe that in his mind, he found after Europe, the chaos of Europe in the 20s and 30s, to raise the excellence, the brilliance of the Roman Empire, I think was not altogether, with that central power, was not altogether unfathomable. However, at the end, he picked the wrong side, clearly. The Italians got out of the war, and in 1945, the Americans went looking for Pound and found him. And the only reason he wasn't shot for treason was because somewhere it was clear to them that would be bad press. And so he was put instead into a tiger cage, which is about that high and 9 feet long, and that's it. And he was in that, and outside for weeks at a time, until he was found guilty. But instead of, like I said, instead of executing him, which was very close, they sent him to St. Elizabeth's Hospital for 9 years. Now, it should be noted that in that tiger cage, somehow he completed what they call the Pisan Cantos, which again is the history of the world through his verse. And I found myself in Geneva when he was still alive, and I had taken from the US a small wafer of, God forgive me, a library book that I had absconded with. And I had his cantos in this book, and a small bit of, I figured that was the most important thing to carry with me on my travels. And I had in mind to go to Rapallo, where he had left the United States for. And on the steps of that Genoa post office, lo and behold, my girlfriend appeared in front of me. She had gotten a job with ABC of some kind, and I never got to Rapallo. We ended up in the Greek islands, because as Zorba the Greek says, when a woman calls a man to her bed, there's only one sin God will not forgive, and that's it. So I never got to Rapallo, much to my chagrin. So this is his first canto, which is based on the Odyssey. And then went down to the ship, set keel to breakers, forth on the godly seas, and we set up mast and sail on that swart ship, bore sheep aboard her, and our bodies also, heavy with weeping, and winds from sternward bore us out onward with bellying canvas. Circe's this craft, the trim-coiffed goddess. Then sat we amidships, wind jamming the tiller. Thus, with stretched sail, we went over sea till day's end. Sun to his slumber, shadows o'er all the ocean, came we then to the bounds of deepest water, to the Cimmerian lands, and peopled cities covered with close-webbed mist, unpierced ever with glitter of sun rays, nor with stars stretched, nor looking back from heaven, swartest night stretched over wretched men there. The ocean flowing backward came we then to the place aforesaid by Circe. Here they did rites, Perimedes and Eurylochus, and drawing sword from my hip, I dug the L-square pitkin, poured we libations unto each the dead, first mead and then sweet wine, water mixed with white flour. Then prayed I many a prayer to the sickly death's heads, as said in Ithaca, sterile bulls of the best for sacrifice, heaping the pyre with goods, a sheep to Tiresias only, black and a bell sheep. Dark blood flowed in the fosse, souls out of Erebus, cadavers dead, of brides, of youths, and of the old who had borne much, souls stained with recent tears, girls tender, men many, mauled with bronze lance-heads, battle spoil, bearing yet dreary arms. These many crowded about me with shouting, pallor upon me, cried to my men for more beasts, slaughtered the herds, sheep slain of bronze, poured ointment, cried to the gods, to Pluto the strong, and praised Persephone. Unsheathed the narrow sword, I sat to keep off the impetuous, impotent dead, till I should hear Tiresias. But first Elpenor came, our friend Elpenor, unburied and cast on the wide earth, limbs that we left in the house of Circe, unwept, unwrapped in sepulchre, since toils urged other, pitiful spirit. And I cried in hurried speech, Elpenor, how art thou come to this dark coast? Camest thou afoot, outstripping seamen? And he in heavy speech, ill fate and abundant wine. I slept in Circe's ingle, going down the long ladder unguarded, I fell against the buttress, shattered the nape nerve, the soul sought Avernus. But thou, O king, I bid remember me. Unwept, unburied, I heap up mine arms, be tombed by seaboard, and inscribed, a man of no fortune, and with a name to come, and set my oar up, that I swung mid fellows. And Anticlea came, whom I beat off, and then Tiresias Theban, holding his golden wand, knew me and spoke first. A second time? Why, man of ill star, facing the sunless dead in this joyless region, stand from the fosse, leave me my bloody bever, for soothsay. And I stepped back, and he, strong with the blood, said then, Odysseus shall return through spiteful Neptune, over dark seas, lose all companions. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next portion. First, we'll read a poem by Sappho, who was from the island of Lesbos. She was exiled at one point in her life to Sicily. It's not clear why. Families in city-states, they were always, in conflict. But there's something, again, you'll hear that there's a purity to her voice that has lasted thousands of years, which is remarkable. She is, of course, known as the Sapphic poet, although she was reputed to be married to someone named, forgive me, the Greek evades me, but it's Kalliklos or something, which and it could be a satirical take from a comedic writer after she'd long gone. It meant something like she was married to Happy Cock, Mr. Everyman, something like that. So with her, there's always a little element of playfulness, even in the purity of her voice. So Marlene Angelis will read.
Which is best? Some say it's a host on horseback. Some say no, foot soldiers the wide world over. Others, naval forces. To me, the best thing is what your heart longs for. Anyone can easily see this. Didn't she whose beauty surpassed all others, Helen, didn't she run away and leave her excellent husband? Didn't she sail over the waves to Asia, off to Troy, forgetting her child, her parents, sparing not a thought? She was diverted, lightly. Makes me think of lovely Anactoria, though she is absent. How I love the way that she walks. I'd rather see her now in motion, the bright expression flashing from her eyes, than the whole assembled Lydian army.
I might add that the Lydian army was a sight to behold, apparently. They had ranks of cavalry and their shields and their helmets, so when she refers that she preferred the sight of this lovely young woman to the entire Lydian army lined up in ranks of 30,000 to 40,000 men, that's quite a statement. Next we'll have Jen Vath read from Cavafy. Constantine Cavafy was born in Alexandria in 1863, and he worked for 30 years in the third circle of irrigation. That's the sanitation department in Alexandria. And he was a guy who would cruise at night Alexandria was famous from the Alexandria Quartet by Lawrence Durrell, in which they made an unwatchable movie about. But he was pretty well known in the bathhouses of Alexandria. In fact, he hired a servant to rumple his bed at night so that his mother didn't know that he was actually in the baths all night with other young dilettantes. So Cavafy had won the Nobel Prize, and he'll be the first of two Nobel Prize winners that we'll hear from tonight. This is The Afternoon Sun.
This room. How well I know it. And now they're renting it. It and the one next door as offices. The whole house has been taken over by agents, businessmen, concerns. But this one room. How familiar. Here by the door was the couch. In front of that, a Turkish carpet on the floor. The shelf, then, with two yellow vases. And on the right, opposite, a wardrobe with a mirror. At the center, the table where he wrote, and the 3 big wicker chairs. There by the window stood the bed where we made love so many times. Poor things. They must be somewhere to this day. There by the window stood the bed. Across it, the afternoon sun used to reach halfway. We'd say goodbye one afternoon at 4, for a week only. But alas, that week would go on forever.
Okay. The next poem is called Ithaca, and it turns out that Jackie Onassis was a big fan of Cavafy, and in fact such a fan that it was the poem that was read at her funeral. So this is called Ithaca.
As you set out for Ithaca, hope the voyage is a long one, full of adventure, full of discovery. Lastagonians and Cyclops, angry Poseidon, don't be afraid of them. You'll never find things like that on your way as long as you keep your thoughts raised high. As long as a rare excitement stirs your spirit and your body. Lastragonians and Cyclops, wild Poseidon, you won't encounter them unless you bring them along inside your soul. Unless your soul sets them up in front of you. Hope the voyage is a long one. May there be many a summer morning when, with what pleasure, what joy, you come into harbors for the first time. May you stop at Phoenician trading stations and buy fine things, mother of pearl and coral, amber and ebony, sensual perfume of every kind, as many sensual perfumes as you can. And may you visit many Egyptian cities to gather stores of knowledge from their scholars. Keep Ithaca always in your mind. Arriving there is what you are destined for. But do not hurry your journey at all. Better if it lasts for years, so that you are old by the time you reach the island, wealthy with all you have gained along the way, not expecting Ithaca to make you rich. Ithaca gave you the marvelous journey. Without her, you would not have set out. She has nothing left to give you now. And if you find her poor, Ithaca won't have fooled you. Wise as you will have become, so full of experience, you will have understood by then what these Ithacas mean.
This next poem is by Yanis Ritsos, who died in 1990. He was born in 1909. He came from a wealthy family that suffered great misfortune. His mother and sister went crazy. Brother went into a sanitarium for tuberculosis, which he followed for several years. So he was known as almost as much as a political activist with communist organizations as much as a poet. He was nominated twice for the Nobel Prize, did not win, but he was awarded the Lenin Prize, which is the highest literary award in the Soviet Union, perhaps not surprisingly. But he was very outspoken in his politics. He had a poem that the Mikis Theodorakis, the Greek composer, wrote music for. It's called Epitaphios, which is something like a coffin, a grave. It's part of the Greek Orthodox ritual on Holy Saturday. And it was that poem that he wrote, Epitaphis, was actually burned in public by the Metaxas administration in front of the Acropolis. So they felt pretty strongly about his political point of view. Of course, there was a Greek civil war before and after World War II, and he ended up being exiled to several Greek islands. Now, what's interesting about this is that I wanted to get away from the touristed islands like Paros and Naxos, which to me looked like Peyton Place. And I ended up on Amorgos, which was dark, cold in the winter, but a great place for writing poetry, which I was interested in doing at the time. And one day, and I would walk, and one day I walked in, even though people lived in these islands for thousands of years, there were a lot of places that they just never went to. They didn't hike anywhere. But I would hike into this deserted area, and one day, it was very foggy, and I was coming to a little inlet, and all of a sudden, out of the fog, a guy with a mustache cut off, he was the museum guard who looked over all the old things. And he said, "Kyriamoros, where are you going? What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm hiking." I said, "This is not for hiking here. Come with me." And it looked pretty grim. I mean, I didn't, so it turns out that Amorgos, in addition to being, I was the only Xenos on the island, in addition to being, solitudinous, was actually the low security prison island for Greek political prisoners under the colonels, and I apparently had stumbled into that area. Meanwhile, he brought me to the top of the telegraph office, and we walked all the way up these Minoan steps, which were 4,000, these wide concrete steps. And the guy, Kyrio Lamoni, at the telegraph office said, Kyrio Moros, tikanis, kala, echis liftaido. And that means you got money here, kid. And so I had asked my little sister, who was 15, to wire me my last $75. Now that wasn't nothing back then. A meal was a dime. A bottle of ouzo was 10 cents. But he started shelling out thousands of drachma notes. At that time, it was 30 drachs to the dollar. So there was a pile. And I said, I know about the secret police here. I don't want to get into trouble. I don't think this is my money. And I don't want to get you into trouble. You better check this. So, Kostaki, Dominda, and in taxi, I'm okay, you're okay. He turns to me and says, "My boy, if this is your money, enjoy our wonderful country under the wonderful dictatorship of the colonels. And if this is not your money, there's a boat leaving Thursday." And I was on it, and little did I know that I was headed for Cyprus eventually, but it was a different country, and I was out of Greece. The Bank of Greece had switched the account slip number for the number of drachmas and given me not $75, but $750. So it gave me a cash grant to continue traveling around the world, which I did for a little less than 2 years. So, yeah. So this is Yannis Ritsos, Penelope's Despair.
It wasn't that she didn't recognize him in the light from the hearth. It wasn't the beggar's rags, the disguise. No, the signs were clear. The scar on his knee, the pluck, the cunning in his eye. Frightened, her back against the wall, she searched for an excuse, a little time, so she wouldn't have to answer, give herself away. Was it for him, then, that she'd used up 20 years? 20 years of waiting and dreaming for this miserable, blood-soaked, white-bearded man? She collapsed, voiceless, into a chair, slowly studied the slaughtered suitors on the floor, as though seeing her own desires dead there. And she said, "Welcome." Hearing her own voice sound foreign, distant. In the corner, her loom covered the ceiling with a trellis of shadows, and all the birds she'd woven with bright red thread in green foliage now.
So this next poem is by another poet, Odysseus Elytus, which was not his original name. He changed his name because he didn't want to be associated with his wealthy, somewhat haute bourgeoisie family by the name of Alapudelis. They made soap and made a fortune doing that. And he also was someone who fought against the fascists coming from Mussolini. And indeed, he self-exiled to Paris from 1969 to 1972, I think, just before the colonels were overthrown. He's seen usually as a poet of joy, but he objected to that. He believed that his poetry was like nature itself, which is neither good or bad, beautiful or ugly, it simply is. So this poem is a little bit of a departure for him, but you'll see what I mean. It has certainly elements of carry on.
The Alfa Romeo. I admired the Parthenon. In its every column, I found the golden mean. But today, if I may say so, I find the good and beautiful in a sports Alfa Romeo. Summer and winter, let there be. All around me, olive groves. Behind me, the centuries. When the road before me takes off and leads me into temptations, I step on it and floor the gas. With the power of a lion and the background of birds, I reach 100 miles per hour. Goodbye, seas and mountains. Goodbye and full speed ahead for the core of lightning.
That was Jen Vath, who I had the pleasure of seeing in a production, a Civil War production, where she played 3 different characters in one play, which is quite a feat, and was also in an Obie Award-winning production of a Sam Shepard play, La Mama. So, and Jen very graciously stepped in at the last minute tonight, so we want to thank her.
Thank you.
Next we have a poem by our very own Penelope Karageorge, who was away on a cruise and who very graciously asked me to host this evening because of that. So may she be having a wonderful time, while however missing her own poem being read here. It's called poem Big Bed.
Maybe it's not so much fun after all, this constant house party you call marriage. Picking up after all the guests. So here I am at 4 a.m. in our king-sized bed, wide awake and lonely while surrounded by people, including your first wife, poking me in the ribs with her elbows, dimpling red curls bouncing, the Shirley Temple of Medusas. And every time you press your thigh to mine, she trills and whispers in my ear about her new husband, your former best friend at that. Far more successful than you in all ways, she smirks. And when you utter one of your many witticisms, still trying to impress her, how she yawns and pronounces you a brilliant bore. Meanwhile, your second wife perches on the headboard in her baby dolls, painting her toenails and telling me how sex was with you, nothing without speed, and then 2 of you exploded the universe. Oh, sure, I'm fond of your mother, but Something about the way she settles there at the foot of the bed, rolling your socks into balls and tucking in $100 bills, winking, "Don't mind me," that bugs me. Ugh. Ouch! Your 12-year-old daughter just kicked me in the shins. Meanwhile, several of my former beaux sit outside the door, drinking and laughing and playing cards and swapping stories. You won't allow them in because somehow that would make me a brazen slut. But you don't hear me. You sleep on, while I'm left to entertain our company. Just as well. Raoul, the Indian architect, just slipped me a diamond necklace under the door with an invitation to go dancing. And Jeb, the Cleveland banker, has his power drill and he's smashing through the wall, chunks of plaster flying, while Oscar, the Washington lawyer, is coming in through the window. And hey, you better move over.
Now, the next poem is rather special, I think. I'm really glad that I found this. This is another one by Odysseus Elytus. It's actually kind of a duet, and it's known as Maria Nefeli, but it's called The Presence. Now, he'd already won the Nobel Prize, but when this came out in 1978, people didn't quite know what to make of it. He actually said that he met a young girl that this poem was based on, and she represented today's young emerging woman, and the antiphonist, the responder, represents kind of the male with more traditional views. So this is The Presence by Odysseus Elytus.
Maria Nefeli. I walk in thorns in the dark of what's to happen and what has, with my only weapon, my only defense, my nails, purple like cyclamens.
Antiphonist. I saw her everywhere, holding a glass and staring in space, lying down, listening to records, walking the streets in wide trousers and an old gabardine, in front of children's store windows, sadder then, and in discotheques, more nervous, eating her nails. She smokes innumerable cigarettes. She is pale and beautiful. But if you talk to her, she doesn't hear at all. It's as if something is happening. She alone hears it and is frightened. She holds your hand tight, tears, but is not there. I never touched her, and I never took from her anything.
He understood nothing. He kept asking all the time, remember? What's to remember? My dreams alone I remember because I see them at night. Days I feel bad. How to say? Unprepared. I found myself so suddenly in life where I hardly expected. I'd say, bah, I'll get used to it. And everything around me ran. Things and people ran, until I set myself to run like crazy. But it seems I overdid, because I don't know. Something strange happened in the end. First, I'd see the corpse, and then the murder. First came the blood, and then the blow and cry. And now when I hear rain, I don't know what's waiting.
Why don't they bury people standing up like archbishops? That's what she'd say to me. And once, I remember, summer on the island, all of us coming from a party, dawn. We jumped over the bars on the museum's garden. She danced on the stones, And she saw nothing.
I saw his eyes. I saw some old olive groves.
I saw a column on a grave, a girl in relief on the stone. She seemed sad and held a small bird in her cupped hand.
He was looking at me. I know he was looking at me. We both were looking at the same stone. We looked at each other through the stone.
She was calm, and in her palm she held a small bird.
She was sitting, and she was dead.
She was sitting, and in her palm she held a small bird. You'll never hold a bird like that. You aren't able.
Oh, if they let me. If they let me.
If who let you?
The one who lets nothing.
He who lets nothing is cut by his shadow and walks away.
His words are white and unspeakable. His eyes deep and without sleep.
The whole upper part of the stone was taken, and with it her name.
Arimna. As if I could still see the letters carved inside the light. Arimna Efe El.
Gone. The whole top gone. There were no letters at all.
Arimna Efe El. There, on the L, the stone had cut and broken. I remember it well.
She must have seen it in a dream, since she remembers.
In my dreams. Yes. In a large sleep that will come sometimes all light and heat and small stony steps. The children will walk in the streets arm in arm like in some old Italian movies. Song everywhere, and enormous women in small balconies watering their flowers.
A large blue balloon will take us high then. Here and there the wind will beat us. The silver domes will stand out first, then the belfries. The streets will appear narrower and straighter than we imagined. The terraces with the white television antennas, and all around the hills, and the kites so close will shave past them, until one moment we'll see the whole sea. On it, the souls will be leaving small white steams.
I have lifted my hand against the mountains, the dark and the demonic of this world. I've asked love why, and rolled her on the floor. War and war, and not one rag to hide deep in our things and forget. Who listens? Who listened? Judges, priests, police. Which is your country? One body is left, me, and I give it. On it, those who know cultivate the holy as the gardeners in Holland tulips, and in it drown who never learned of sea or swimming. Flux of the sea and your star's distant influx, stand by me.
I have lifted my hand against the unexorcised demons of the world, and from the place of illness I have exited to the sun and to the light, self-exiled.
And from too many storms I've exited self among humans exiled.
Now, as we approach the latter part of the evening, I'm going to read another poem by Constantine Cavafy, our Alexandrian friend. He wrote a lot of times using mythic or historic episodes, and this is called The God Abandons Antony. And I'm going to follow that by an adaptation that our very own Leonard Cohen wrote called Alexandra Leaving. Now, the funny thing about this is that most people don't know Leonard Cohen was actually among a group of young Canadian poets that were touted as the best of Canada in the late 50s, and he even made a tour of readings, and found he couldn't pay his bills with reading poetry or writing poetry, and then he decided to become a sort of a folk star. His music is hard to categorize really, but his colleagues in poetry saw that as sort of selling out. But as it turns out, I had another bit of serendipity. I was working in an agricultural collective in the Negev desert, and I'd heard that he was going to sing in Tel Aviv. And I already was a fan of his. So I got my way to Tel Aviv, and I got there early, and I had on a McGregor shirt. If you remember those, it was red plaid with yellow and blue lines. It looked very American. And I walked in, and there was no security. So I ended up talking to the group and him. And before I knew it, I was on the bandstand, and they were saying, "Can you sing?" That's the truth. I don't sing a note. But here, take the tambourine. So there I was with the tambourine as he was singing. But at the same time, the young people who were there, he said to them suddenly, "I can't see you all up in the balcony." It was a basketball arena. So come on down. So they started coming down, and the security personnel objected to this strenuously and started ejecting people bodily from the floor. And before I knew it, I was holding Leonard back, swinging his guitar, saying, Leonard, it was a famous episode. So anyway, and then to further this story, after the concert was over, we were back there, we were doing a documentary, we're in the dressing room, and this lovely blonde, who I had no idea who it was, it was Jennifer Warnes, I later found out, years later. Anyway, I said, I have to get back, otherwise I'm gonna miss the bus, and they're expecting me to milk the cows tomorrow morning. So, or I gotta stay and I have to call. So she said, well, you can stay in my room, and I said, you mean in your bed or on the floor? And I said, well, I'm not offering my bed, So the arrogance of youth. I didn't stay, but it was very special. And I saw Leonard years later in the lobby of the Algonquin Hotel, and I was so flummoxed by the fact that he was wearing a three-piece business suit that looked like he stepped out of Wall Street. And I just didn't have it in me. I just couldn't fathom. I didn't understand it, and I said nothing. But we exchanged glances, and I always felt regret that I just couldn't get past the uniform. Later, I found out that his family was in the tailoring business in Canada, and that he liked wearing a good suit. So, anyway, so this is "The God Abandons Antony" by Constantine Cavafy. Also, this is about Mark Antony. This is the day before he dies. He sent out messages to Octavius, "I will fight you hand to hand, mano a mano, one on one." Octavius said, "You must be kidding. I mean, there's a lot of ways to die, but that's not one of them for me." And so he refused. And that previous night, Antony had heard this curious band of revelers leaving the city, singing, dancing, and always thought that was a premonition that his god Bacchus had abandoned him. And indeed, the gods had. It was his last day on earth. So the next day, Cleopatra had already gone up to her tomb and sent word that she had killed herself. She had not. And when he heard this, he plunged his sword into himself. Did not die right away. And then she came down and spent his last moments with her. And then she, of course, went and found her pet snake. So, "The God Abandons Antony" by Constantine Cavafy. When suddenly, at midnight, you hear an invisible procession going by with exquisite music, voices, "Don't mourn your luck that's failing now, work gone wrong, your plans all proving deceptive. Don't mourn them uselessly, as one long prepared and graced with courage, say goodbye to her, the Alexandria that is leaving. Above all, don't fool yourself. Don't say it was a dream, your ears deceived you. Don't degrade yourself with empty hopes like these. as one long prepared and graced with courage, as is right for you who proved worthy of this kind of city. Go firmly to the window and listen with deep emotion, but not with the whining, the pleas of a coward. Listen your final delectation to the voices, to the exquisite music of that strange procession, and say goodbye to her, to the Alexandria you are losing. And this is Alexandra Leaving, adapted from Cavafy's God Abandoned by Leonard Cohen. Suddenly the night has grown colder. The god of love preparing to depart, Alexandra hoisted on his shoulder. They slip between the centuries of the heart, upheld by the simplicities of pleasure. They gain the light they formlessly entwine, and radiant beyond your widest measure, they fall among the voices and the wine. It's not a trick, your senses all deceiving, a fitful dream the morning will exhaust. Say goodbye to Alexandra leaving. Then say goodbye to Alexandra lost. Even though she sleeps upon your satin, even though she wakes you with a kiss, do not say the moment was imagined. Do not stoop to strategies like this. As someone long prepared for this to happen, go firmly to the window. Drink it in, exquisite music. Alexandra laughing, your first commitments tangible again, and you who had the honor of her evening, and by the honor had your own restored, say goodbye to Alexandra leaving with her lord. Even though she sleeps with your satin, even though she wakes you with a kiss, do not say the moment was imagined. Do not stoop to strategies like this. As someone long prepared for this to happen, in full command of every plan you wrecked, do not choose a coward's explanation that hides behind the cause and the effect. And you who were bewildered by a meaning whose code was broken, crucifix uncrossed, say goodbye to Alexandra leaving, then say goodbye to Alexandra lost. So we're going to end the evening with our very own Bob Dylan and his lyric to his song, Tangled Up in Blue. I mean, he just won the Nobel Prize, so I thought it would be interesting to hear some of his words after the other poets. Before we do this, I just want to, Robin is not here tonight, I suppose, which is sad because he's been giving a little bit of a speech, which is to say that the Cornelia St Cafe, as he puts it, has had 77 rent increases in the 38-year span of its history. And if he were to charge, according to that rent increase, a croissant would be $77. So apparently there is real pressure, like so much of New York. I mean, it defies my imagination. The very cultural fabric that draws people to New York City, Manhattan, is being cannibalized by, the very people who want to come here. So whoever would have expected to see luxury high-rises on 42nd Street and 11th and 12th Avenue, and that's pressuring all the ma and pa small theaters that had disappeared. When I came up in theater in the 1980s, there were 242 off-Broadway theater houses, little houses, in a storefront, in a loft, in a basement, and they're all gone. The big institutional theaters are still there, but they have all the funding, and I understand that one artistic director of a major nonprofit theater is making $1 million a year in salary because he's a fundraiser. So they get it. They're successful. But I defy anyone to say that they have seen a production on stage that has the forces of nature that Kazan unleashed in the late 40s and on that he did today. I don't see it. So I'll leave you one more story. Arthur Miller told me. I worked with Arthur Miller for 3 years on his play Incident at Vichy. trying to get it to a major venue. And he'd come to a stage reading that I had put on 42nd Street at the Fairbanks Theater, which is now gone, 325-seat theater. Beautiful, famously beautiful theater. Anyway, I said, he said, I like what you do with my play, Incident of Vichy, and how come I don't know you? I said, well, I did this and that. A play I had directed was in the New York Times, Dance for Me, Simeon. But he wasn't impressed. He was just coming out of Robert Falls in Chicago's Goodman Theater. He did a play called Finishing the Picture about the Misfits, did not do well. But he said, and then as desperate, I said, I did take a knapsack I was virtually penniless, but made my way around the world in a little less than 2 years. And that caught his ear. He said, I think a hothouse effect has taken over in New York theater. Because either you're inside the hothouse, and if you are, those plants are nurtured and brought along. But if you're outside the hothouse, where the real world is happening, where you get to know the smell of an armpit or how to milk a cow, those people are never let in. And whether you get in by charm, credentials, or connections, no matter how many gallons of Starbucks you get for your superior, and no matter how good you get with Excel spreadsheets, he thinks if the worst trauma in your life is that you don't get to order your favorite off the brunch menu, how much depth can your theater have? And as a result, he said, he felt theater in New York had become anemic. That's quite a statement from Arthur Miller, who has the pick of the best people around. And it was obvious to him that in the winter of his life and career, he was 89, that somehow the structure had been cemented and solidified, the pipeline had been clogged or become very elitist, but it wasn't producing great art. So in any case, that in addition to the fact that real estate is still going through the roof, we are losing, and in fact, the Cornelia Street is threatened, its existence is under threat. So Robin Hirsch, the owner and cultural commissar, is looking for any help. He's trying to change this into a 501c3 venue. And if anyone, I get on their mailing list, and he's sending emails out to people to contact assemblymen, any help that he can find. So it would be a terrible loss. This is one of the last coffee houses like this. I didn't pay for this. It was free. It was given. If this goes, personally, I took that very personally. I've done other things here, and I would miss it terribly, and it would be a loss to you all, the culture, the people of the city. So, Tangled Up in Blue by Bob Dylan. Early one morning, the sun was shining, and I was laying in bed, wondering if she changed at all, if her hair was still red. Her folks, they said our lives together sure was going to be rough. And I never did like Mama's homemade dress, and Papa's bank book wasn't big enough. And I was standing on the side of the road, rain falling on my shoes, heading out for the East Coast. Lord knows I paid some dues getting through. Tangled up in blue. She was married when we first met, soon to be divorced. I helped her out of a jam, I guess, but I used a little too much force. We drove that car as far as we could, abandoned it out west, split up on a dark, sad night, both agreeing it was best. She turned around and looked at me as I was walking away. I heard her say over my shoulder, "We'll meet again someday on the avenue." Tangled up in blue. I had a job in the Great North Woods, working as a cook for a spell, but I never did like it all that much, and one day the axe just fell. So I drifted down to New Orleans, where I happened to be employed working for a while in a fishing boat, right outside of Delacroix. But all the while I was alone, the past was close behind. I seen a lot of women, but she never escaped my mind, and I just grew tangled up in blue. She was working in a topless place, and I stopped in for a beer. I just kept looking at her side of her face in the spotlight, so clear. And later on, as the crowd thinned out, I was just about to do the same. She was standing there in back of my chair, said to me, "Don't I know your name?" I muttered something underneath my breath. She studied the lines on my face. I must admit, I felt a little uneasy when she bent down to tie the laces of my shoe, tangled up in blue. She lit a burner on the stove and offered me a pipe. "I thought you'd never say hello," she said. "You look like the silent type." And she opened up a book of poems and handed it to me, written by an Italian poet from the 15th century. And every one of them words rang true, glowed like burning coal, pouring off of every page, like it was written in my soul from me to you, tangled up in blue. I lived with him on Montague Street in a basement down the stairs. There was music in that cafe at night and revolution in the air. And then he started into dealing with slaves, and something inside of him died. She had to sell everything she owned and froze up inside. And when finally the bottom fell out, I became withdrawn. The only thing I knew how to do was to keep on keeping on like a bird that flew, tangled up in blue. So now I'm going back again. I got to get to her somehow. All the people we used to know, they're an illusion to me now. Some are mathematicians, some are carpenters' wives. Don't know how it all got started. I don't know what they're doing with their lives, but me, I'm still on the road, heading for another joint. We always did feel the same. We just saw it from a different point of view. Tangled up in blue. Thank you again for coming, and hope you enjoyed the evening, and hope we can do it again into the future.